with the impacts of Helene that occurred late September, in October, the unemployment rate shot up to over 10%, which was the highest in the rate for that month. In terms of, I've also included on this chart the graph, but also below a table of the actual unemployment as well. In terms of actual persons unemployed, unemployed persons rose to over 15,800 in October. Those are levels we haven't seen since the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, so like April, May of 2020. The unemployment rate dropped by over 3%, you can see, from 10.4 to 7.2 in November, and the county went from having the highest rate in the state to the second highest for that period. Unemployment was still over 10,600 in November, which is still around 3 times the level that we saw pre-Helene. You can compare that to the September actual unemployed persons number. And this will be important to track unemployment over the next several months, as historically, in sort of that January, February timeframe, that's typically when unemployment has tended to peak in the early winter months, particularly in the tourism, leisure, hospitality sectors, which tend to slow down after the holiday season. So we will move to housing. So a lot of things to look at here, but a key indicator here is tracking, given our reliance on property tax as a revenue source. In non-revaluation years, which we've had for the last several years, as well as we're slated to have next year as well, new construction is often one of the main drivers for growth in the property tax base. The chart on the slide here shows the percent change in single family. Again, this is year to date, so the latest information we have is November, compared to FY24, so the same period last year. You can see that the impact after Helene is significant. New construction permits dropped around 60% since the start of October compared to the prior year. On a year-to-date basis, so for July through November, on a year-to-date basis, new construction permits were down 23%, which equates to 83 less units. Impact of Helene on our existing housing stock as well. As a result of the storm, over 9,200 residential units were damaged, with 331 destroyed and 609 suffering major damage. Beyond the devastating implications of that for our residents, of course, and the broader community, from a local government revenue perspective, moving forward, those damaged units will have an impact on our property tax base, with all the financial implications that brings, given that, as we know, property tax is by far the county's largest revenue source, as well as for all local governments in this area as well. So I will move to really looking at tourism, and the proxy for that is occupancy tax. As I mentioned, occupancy tax is a key indicator for tourism-related economic activity in the county. As I'm sure you're all aware, the tourism industry in our area is a very important economic engine for our local economy. And the tax is received 1 month ahead of sales tax, which we'll talk about in the next slide. So you can see the occupancy tax we've received through November. So we're 2 months back, whereas with sales tax, we receive our collections 3 months back. So we only have October. A good sort of helpful as contextual information from a sales tax projection perspective as well. I will note nearly all occupancy tax proceeds are passed on to the Buncombe County TDA, with only a small portion kept by the county for administrative expenses. So this is we're not highlighting this as a significant county revenue source, but it's included to just give some insight into impacts to the tourism industry in our region, which again is a very important part of our local economy. The chart on the slide, similar to the last slide, details percent change in occupancy tax collections for FY25 compared to the same period in FY24. So like I mentioned, this is also year-to-date, so the latest information we have is November. As context, prior to Helene, occupancy tax collections had seen minimal growth for the last 2 years or so. So we were in a pretty low growth environment as far as occupancy tax goes, as well as sales tax, which I'll discuss in the next slide. And we see a continuation of that trend in that July, August timeframe. So it was pre-Helene, we were still on that trend. And then we see those significant decline, September, October, and November. Pretty interesting to note, particularly that 37% decline in September. I mean, if you think back, the storm hit, I believe it was September 27th. Maybe a couple days before that, there was that predecessor rain event, which flooded a lot of areas. So, but if you even take that into account, just a couple days of impact really in September. So you might scratch your head and say, why is it 37%? I think potentially part of that is due to the fact days after the month in which they're due. So for September, that would mean occupancy taxes were due October 20th, and we all know what the situation was like, water outages, et cetera. So I think there's probably a lot of challenges for businesses in sending, being a little bit behind on their occupancy tax collections there. As I'm sure many are aware, October is also one of the strongest months for tourism in our area, given leaf peeping season and the strong sales there. Strong sales many businesses in that sector typically have help sustain them through the winter as tourism activity sort of abates a bit. As a result, the timing of the storm will likely exacerbate Helene-related impacts on occupancy tax in our tourism sector in FY25. The percent declines in November and December, I mean, they're really staggering if you look at it. I mean, nearly 75% down in October, 60% in November. Those are the largest percent decreases since the start of the pandemic as well, in that April, May 2020 timeframe. On a year-to-date basis, occupancy tax collections are down 35%, which equates to 5.9 on a budget that's typically 35 million. So we will go to sales tax, which is the last indicator I'll cover, which is the most direct, like I mentioned, the most direct indicator of overall economic activity in the county, since it's charged on all retail sales. From a local government revenue perspective, it's also the county's third largest revenue source at around 11% of our general fund budget. The chart on the slide, similar to the last couple slides, it shows percent change in sales tax distributions versus the same period in the prior year. Again, as I mentioned, sales tax collections to look at, and this information is year to date. Like occupancy tax, we saw a nearly 2-year trend of minimal growth in the neighborhood of 1% to 2%. And so I include the FY24 column here to kind of illustrate that point, that this is the total growth we saw in FY24, just 2%. So we were really operating in, again, below growth environment. Looking at September with the significant decline, and I should say, and so we were seeing that pre-Helene, that trend still, as you can see in July and August, low, like 1% growth essentially. Moving to, getting into Helene impacts, looking at September, again, you see that 11% decline. That's quite, that's quite staggering. Again, if you think about, there's only a couple days potentially that there would be impact. But again, like occupancy tax, sales taxes are collected the 20 days after the end of the month. So again, September would have been, the deadline would have been October 20th. You can imagine, of course, what challenges businesses were facing then in getting their sales tax back to the state, essentially. So I also wanted to talk about November. So we saw a decline of over 16%. So that's really interesting to look at when you compare it, again, to September, which we talked about. There's potentially only a couple days of impact there, and it's not that much less, as well as the occupancy tax collections that we saw on the previous slide. It was like negative 74% in October. So a couple things I want to note there. One, the collection issue I mentioned for September. There could be some bleed over of September sales into October, given that businesses were behind potentially on their sales tax back to the state, given, again, like I mentioned, that situation in the whole month of October, essentially. As well, the declines in certain market sectors, such as in tourism, like we saw in the occupancy tax data in the previous slide, may have been partially balanced out by increased emergency and recovery-related spending in other areas, such as at, like hardware stores. And I personally saw really high demand for gas, generators, chainsaws, water tanks, and I'm sure many of you did as well. So that might be, sort of balancing some of the impacts we saw to the tourism industry out in the data that we're seeing. The third point I wanted to make is that about 2/3 of our county sales tax is actually distributed to us. So the state collects sales tax, I should say, distributes it to counties. So the county sales tax, about 2/3 of that's distributed from the state, is based on a point of sale basis. So I've included this table below the chart. So point of sale basis, what does that mean? That means tax collected on actual sales that occurred in the county. So that's what you would normally think of with sales tax. You bought something, sales tax, the local sales tax is charged, and that should stay within the county. But actually about 1/3 of the county sales tax we receive is distributed to us on a per capita basis. What does that mean? So that means distributed to us based on, so pooled statewide, all proceeds from, so it would be Article 40, pooled state relative to the state population as a whole. So you can see on the chart the per capita distributions. So that would have, you would theoretically, less of a impact from localized impact from Helene that we saw in our area, since it's kind of spread out around the state. And you can see that with the percentages in the per capita article line on this table. The per capita distributions still generally follow that pre-Helene statewide trend of minimal low single-digit growth that we saw, which helps balance out the more extreme localized impacts from the point of sale articles that we saw in October. So I'll wrap up sales tax by saying as well that October through December is typically our strongest 3-month period of sales, with the holiday season, of course, the leaf peeping season, as I mentioned, for occupancy tax as well. So similar to occupancy tax, the timing of the storm will likely exacerbate Helene-related impacts on sales tax revenue in FY25. On a year-to-date basis, sales tax distributions are down 7%, which equates to a little over $1 million less than the same period last year. And again, this is still with 8 months left to go. So we only have 4 months, and we're already down $1 million in sales tax. And I will just close out this section with some highlights of what we just covered. So again, given impacts from Helene, wanted to begin our FY25 budget outlook this morning around navigate economic conditions that we need to navigate for the rest of FY25, focusing in on employment, housing, occupancy pandemic in October, and while it came down a little bit in November, there's still over 10,000 persons classified as unemployed with the winter months still ahead. In terms of housing, particularly from a local government damage to the existing housing stock, with over 9,200 residential units damaged, and in addition, growth from new construction, which is a major source of growth in the tax base during non-revaluation years, has significantly slowed due to impacts from the storm. Occupancy tax, again, indicator of tourism-related economic activity, is down nearly 6 million compared to the prior year, which is a 35% decline, with 7 months of collection still left to go. And sales tax, which is an indicator for overall economic activity, is down over 1 million, which is a 7% decline compared to the last fiscal year, with 8 months left to go.
Are there any questions for Jay?
I have a revenue question. Thank you for the presentation. It's really insightful. And I do, it's devastating to see those numbers. Hard to swallow. My question was really around outside revenue from other Helene recovery revenue. Will we talk about that, or will we discuss that later?
We're gonna get there.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Well, I do actually, one last question about that. On the housing data,
Yes.
what about, I've seen just visually, you can see multifamily housing construction going on in a pretty good amount across the county. Is that up or?
Why we sort of highlighted single family is multifamily is a little bit lumpier, like month to month. So one development comes on, a lot of units in that month, but then peaks and valleys month over month. So we were presenting it month over month. Decided to highlight single family since it's easier to see the trend there. I don't know for certain what the multifamily developments look like relative to last year.
Property tax endpoint, is
Yeah.
it kind of less than single? I mean, from a per parcel, I guess, perspective, I would presume that multifamily.
That's a question for our tax office, and we'll take that and get an answer.
I just curious. Thanks.
Yeah,
Just
Amy, you can go
quick
first.
question, and this just may be me and not remembering how this all works, but so the occupancy tax, the majority of it going to the TDA, and I know there's a lot of laws around that, but is this something that could temporarily change to right side the
Not without
county
a
budget?
legislative change.
So, and that's at the state level?
Yes.
That we are talking about, okay. So I don't know if you heard, but they actually are moving some of the, resources to our side of the state from Raleigh finally with the governor, so we might have an ear, just saying.
Question about the permits. I'm not presuming that this what I'm about to ask substitutes for new permits. But is there are there any data about reconstruction and renovation permits? Not to say that that replaces the lost income from the new home or the tax income, but just curious as an indicator of rebuilding here in the county versus just letting things lie empty and parcels just being abandoned, for example. Or do we have any data on that?
We have seen substantial volume in the permits department, and as a result of recovery. The legislature did make a change that waived permit fees for that through the end of the calendar year. So we have seen substantial volume in building permits for the county. The city has its own permits office, so but that volume has been substantially more than you would see in a normal time span.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Did you mention they waived the permit fees? I don't know how much of the county budget or the city budget comes from cost of permits, but does the county get reimbursed for the fact that those fees are waived?
No.
Okay.
Any other questions for Jay? Normally Jay is also looking at our federal and state trends as well to inform what we're doing, but what we're seeing obviously is very localized, and that impacts us in terms of revenue in a different way than it does outside of Western North Carolina or across the country. So I'm going to discuss projected revenues this morning in 5 categories. Here you see revenues as currently budgeted for the 2025 fiscal year. Property tax is the county's largest revenue stream at 65% of revenues. Sales tax makes up another 11%. These two sources of revenue are unrestricted revenues, meaning that we can use them for any legal use. Intergovernmental revenue comprises about 11.5% of total revenues, but are largely restricted to specific purposes. County sales and service revenues are based on demand and contribute just under 6% of the revenue budget. The remaining 7% is made up of a variety of other revenue sources that we will discuss in a few minutes. Ad valorem property tax revenues are collected by the County Tax Collections Office. As of Monday, collections were at 93.52% for the year, 0.9% behind this time last year. For percent collected is around $2.6 million. The budget for this revenue also includes registered motor vehicles property tax and interest on unpaid taxes. While damages to property from Helene do not impact what has been billed to property owners, we anticipate that some taxpayers with damages to their property, along with increased unemployment in the community, will have difficulty paying bills on property. We budgeted this year based on the prior year's collection rate of 99.75% and estimates of county values provided in the spring. As we realize how those values translate into what was billed and can be collected, we're looking at coming in between 2 to 2.5% under budget on property tax. Some of you have heard my office refer to sales tax as a volatile revenue stream. Massive unprecedented increases were seen in sales tax of around 20% immediately after COVID, but those gains have been followed by virtually no growth over the last year and a half. With a 3-month lag in reporting, we only just received October sales tax receipts 2 weeks ago, showing a 24% drop in our point of sales tax. Before October, we were trending just slightly under last year's actuals year to date. While we budgeted a modest 2% increase this year in sales tax revenues, we do not expect to meet that and have used a variety of research and indicators to project between $3.5 to $7.5 million under budget. Intergovernmental revenue is largely restricted revenue. Most of this revenue is tied to mandated services provided by Health and Human Services, with the largest revenue streams related to the administration of Medicaid and food and nutrition services. This revenue is dependent on provision of the service and is received only if the expenditures are made for that program. There are also some interlocal revenue agreements for public safety, which are based on a percentage of county expenditures. As we look across this revenue stream, we are seeing potential gaps of $1.2 to $3.2 million under budget.
John, can you say that again? Interlocal governments related to public safety?
We have some interlocal agreements related to public safety, 911, our identification bureau.
Right. Okay.
There are some interlocal agreements with municipalities. Sales and service. This revenue stream is made up of a variety of sales and services across about a dozen different departments. We are expecting losses in budgeted ambulance, planning, and parking revenue. Additionally, we have tax collection agreements that are based on collection amounts, including occupancy tax. And with reduced tax revenues, these agreements will yield less revenue than budgeted. This stream is projected at a range of $3.7 to $4.5 million under budget. There are a variety of other revenues. The main ones we are looking at include the Register of Deeds excise tax, which is related to real estate transactions, and is coming over $1 million under budget. The state did suspend collection of some permits and fees in the months following Helene, and this led to losses in our permits and fees ledger, which makes up almost $6 million of budgeted revenues. Another $6 million of budget in this category is investment earnings, which we do not expect to keep pace with last year as interest rates drop. Across these revenue streams, we are projecting between $2 to $3.9 million under budget. All told, our analysis projects a range of decreased revenues of between $15 to $25 million. This is not insubstantial. Are there any questions on the revenue projections?
John, can you help us understand how you determine the projection ranges?
There's a variety of methods differing on the different type of projection. I mean, some revenue is as easy as saying we have 5 months of data, what's 7 more months of data? Other things are seasonal. We look at what has been happening, we look at prior years. So there's a variety of methods when you look at all these different types of revenue to ascertain what sort of projection you're getting at.
Thank you.
And specifically, follow up on that with the sales tax, because if I'm remembering back earlier, Jay showed it was about 1 million right now that we're at a loss, but you're projecting somewhere between 3 and 7 million. So can you help us understand why that projection?
So as also this is a range where we expect through 1/3 of the year, and we were already trending flat to last year. We did budget 2% above last year. So if we're trending there, you're looking at $3 to $3.5 million just at that range. However, if we continue to see more substantial issues related to our recovery and spending and our tourism and spending in locally, then we could see much more. And that's why we have a range projected like this.
So you're saying, I just want to make sure I understand. So you're saying that even if from here on out we come in right around the 2%, which was originally projected, we still would be down about the 3 million?
If we were we budgeted 2% above last year.
Right.
For the percent above last year, so we were already trending pre-storm under budget. So with $1 million lost through the first third of the year, if you just project that out without considering the local prevailing economic conditions.
I'll add briefly as well, as Jay mentioned, the timing, because we know that normally this season of the year would be our biggest season for sales tax, which is the October, November, December. We're losing that based on the Hurricane Helene expense. So we would not expect to see a large increase between now and the end of the fiscal year. I see Jay nodding, so if there's anything else you want to add. But really, sales tax is not a straight line. It is really based on our economy. And we know that December time is what really helps us to see it meet our.
Thank you.
Answer your question.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm also curious, though, back to the projection ranges, I'm sorry, John, I keep
Yes.
harping on this. Is it possible, as we head into the discussion, though, about potential reductions, to have some actuals of where we are before we really know what kind of reductions we actually have to make? Where are we year to date? Not projection-based, but actuals.
We can pull some actuals, and we actually do have that in our afternoon discussion.
Perfect, thank you.
Most of the projections are based on what we have brought in year to date.
Trying to understand the intergovernmental again.
Yes.
You said is it mostly like it's Health and Human Services, so Medicaid. So is the projection then that we will have fewer people who need those services and therefore less reimbursement from the federal government?
It's a variety of different revenue sources. Some of it's what we call uncapped revenue, as long as we keep spending it. Like a Medicaid, for determining Medicaid eligibility, we'll get 75 cents for every dollar we spend. However, there are other revenue streams which are what we call capped revenue, and that, say, for some of the social work services and child welfare, once they hit the cap of revenue, then that's all the revenue there is for that particular service, and the county must assume all the costs going forward.
Okay, so I'm trying to understand why this would go down in a time of crisis. So I guess what you're saying, tell me if I'm correct, is that it's the fact that there's this cap and there are going to be more people needing services Is that where
Yes.
we're coming from?
Yes,
Trying to-
so some of our services are capped revenue. If there's a greater demand for those services, there will be greater county cost incurred.
Is that where this money is coming from? Because it's not gonna be from less federal reimbursement if it's not capped, right?
Yes, and also, like I said, with some of our public safety agreements, those are based on a percentage of expenditures. So if we make cutbacks to some of those services, then we're going to not receive those, we're going to receive a smaller percentage of those revenues.
And why would we make them less, why would we offer fewer services?
So I'm going to get to that.
Okay. And I won't be
Expenditures
here,
are,
that's okay.
expenditures are next, but with,
Oh, I-
with, projected loss of $15 to $25 million, we'll need to make some
Right,
changes.
of course. Okay, thank you.
My question was gonna be, and, Ms. Pender, I think, was getting at it, that in your variety of tools for making projections, did it also include looking at places that have experienced a disaster, like a tropical storm, and what's in a tourism economy, and what's the bounce back expectation?
Yes, and this afternoon, we're going to go in a deeper dive with the commissioner around revenues and how we're impacted for future years. But we have done some research, and you're often looking at years for recovery for these sorts of revenue streams after a disaster of this magnitude.
Can I ask this question about property tax? I see the downfall that you're gonna have with your projection, but do you actually know that you got 331 houses that are completely destroyed? You got 609 that suffered major damage, which could go into completely destroyed if it's structurally not sound where it has to be destroyed. Then you got 9,200 residents who suffered damage that could fall into either of them categories as well. Mm-hmm. So when that has taken place, have you already, say, you assuming that this property tax will not come to you, even though it has been billed, but it will not come to you at all?
There is some assumption that there will be difficulty for residents to pay property tax, and that's baked in, that is built into this projection, if that's what you're asking. Yes, sir.
Quick question. So, I know that you can't build long-term programs on one-time grants. Curious if expiration of grants is included in other revenues.
So we do not budget grants in the general fund.
Okay.
We have a separate grants fund. So there are no grants considered in this projection.
Thank you.
If there are no more questions on revenue projections, I'm going to talk about fund balance. Expenditures must be balanced by revenues, and if revenues are less than expenditures, the gap can be made up by an appropriation of fund balance. We have a fund balance policy that requires maintaining a general fund budget available fund balance. That would sustain about 2 months of county operations without incoming revenue in a crisis. As we finished fiscal $3 million of fund balance, leaving 17% remaining. This was the first use of fund balance at year-end by the county since 2002. The fiscal year 2025 budget currently has $15.7 million, which if fully expended, would drop us below our policy minimum. All this to say that making up a deficit of $15 to $25 million by appropriating fund balance is not a fiscally viable path. Assistant County Manager Tim Love is here to review some of the legislation that has been passed over the
Good morning, everyone. We've got a quick slide here just to begin to talk about legislation that we've seen at the state and federal level. I'm sure many of you have been following this legislation, and I'm not here to walk through every piece of every legislation, but I do want to hit some of the highlights. And so on the left side, you can see, at the state level, we've seen a flurry of activity that dates back to immediately following the storm, and a number of bills that are listed there. Some of these bills ended up taking on much more than just Helene-related response, but we did see, the state really lean in a lot of different ways. What I would say about the state's current contributions, many of these were to fund specific types of funding, not necessarily to specifically fund at the local level. And so examples of that, we saw NCEM, Emergency Management, receive, $50 million that could be distributed at a later date. But that is viewed as, from the NCM lens, as a last ditch opportunity as we wait for the federal and local activity to play out. Also, we saw the creation of a $100 million cash flow loan program specifically for local governments. As of today, that program isn't up and running. We hope that it will be, and we continue to collect information on what that program would entail. Also at the state level, the state has made funds available to DPI specifically to support education. We've seen funds also made available to the Association of County Commissioners, the League of Municipalities, to fund capacity building at the local government level. My point in talking about these state funds is that these funds are useful, but again, aren't directly related to the operations necessarily of a local government like Buncombe County or any town or jurisdiction that you live in. What John has highlighted today is a potential loss of revenue in our current year, and so we haven't seen what you would refer to as maybe revenue replacement, which is one of the major things that we've been exploring in our advocacy. The main avenue that we have seen that is through the cash flow loan program that I mentioned that currently is not up and running. As we shift gears to the federal side, the federal support has come in waves and in many different ways. And so we've seen a lot of federal legislation, the most meaningful occurring, of course, at the end of the calendar year. I'm sure many of you were following that as we were. But since the beginning, we've seen tons of support. FEMA's been on the ground since the very early days, the Army Corps, and many of our jurisdictions. The American Relief Act specifically continued that support for local efforts and basically keeping FEMA on the ground, keeping the Corps picking up debris. And those are just a couple of the federal departments that are supporting us. There's many more, including Ag and the EPA and others. I've stuck this in the legislation bucket, but it's not new, and this refers to the FEMA Community Disaster Loan Program. This has existed for a number of years, and the purpose of this program is to assist local governments in dealing with, again, sort of cash flow related issues. And you think about the cost of debris removal is not as useful to larger municipalities, and I think there's a good amount of research that's been done on that topic. Additionally, we saw the CDBG, disaster relief specifically, that's administered by HUD. That's been a tool that was made available at the end of the year in the federal legislation, and where we saw $12 billion allocated overall, about 1.4 to the state, and then another portion outside of that specifically to the city of Asheville. And so that's a really exciting opportunity as we look at housing. What I have to underscore here is, those funds still need to go through a process. They're not here today, and are highly dependent on the ability for both the state, the city of Asheville, and others to get a plan approved by HUD. But did want to highlight that. We've been in discussions with state and federal reps, locally. Governor Stein has stood up the GROW NC entity, which I think was mentioned by Ms. Churchill. And so we look forward to working with those folks to understand how those CDBG funds will make it to Buncombe County specifically. We do know that those funds will have strings on them. They'll need to be mostly housing related, specifically low to moderate income individuals, but we'll continue to see where that goes. Finally, I'll mention the SBA, Disaster Loan Program. Highlight two things that we need to know. This program was overspent before Helene, either score that. However, funding came at the end of the year, and we know that across the state there's over 2,000 applications for loans in North Carolina for this program, totaling over $170 million. So those funds will go quickly. I would take this opportunity to state that folks that have not applied for the SBA loan program should. Right? This is a tool. If oversubscribed, you got to get in the line to be able to access those funds. I'd also note that although it's the SBA Small Business Administration, these funds can be applied to individuals as well. And so you should not view this strictly through the lens of, I must be a business. So that's your public service announcement on SBA loan. We continue to follow legislation. We continue to advocate. We're really hopeful that we'll continue to see more funding come to our jurisdiction in the near future. However, I have to underscore that those funding, they're not here today. And so as we continue a budget conversation, we have to plan with what we have in hand. Hope is not a strategy. It is something that I've heard in the past. And so a lot of our discussions are about what we have in hand and that we can actually work to talk about legislation, but to talk about FEMA and the reimbursement process. And I think many of you are probably aware that the way FEMA distribute funds is often in the form of reimbursement. That means that, as a local government or an individual, I will spend money and then request FEMA send me dollars in the future when I'm able to justify that expense. And so that's how we proceed as we are repairing county facilities, libraries, parks, all of those things. It's on a reimbursement basis. And while we're super hopeful that many of the items that we request reimbursement for will be in fact reimbursed, we have no guarantee of that. And so that's an important item I want to underscore today. There is no guarantee that 100% of the things we request from FEMA to be reimbursed will be. Additionally, the timeline on that reimbursement varies greatly. And I'm not here for doom and gloom, but I don't want anyone to expect that we're going to start getting FEMA reimbursements, in this current fiscal year. Necessarily a check that's right around the corner is my point in making that comment. Additionally, I'd note that, it's not as simple as saying, well, all county employees that work during the storm are going to get their hours reimbursed. When I say hours reimbursed, they've been paid. We made payroll. But it doesn't mean that the county will be reimbursed for those hours because, in fact, FEMA reimburses for not the base position. They reimburse for the overtime or the unbudgeted funds that were utilized. And so I say this just to give you a picture of what we're seeing at the state and federal and local level, and would welcome any quick questions from y'all, but also want to keep us on track with the agenda.
I have a question. Can you clarify, because you talked about FEMA kind of in those reimbursements, and then there's our budget, right, our return budget, and the revenue loss and everything. And can you, from the finance, from the budgeting standpoint, help us understand, like, is there any mix of that, or are those two completely separate pots? The way that you're looking at it with the money? Can you
Sure.
walk us through that?
I'm going to defer to our budget and finance staff on exactly how that gets done. I know.
Currently, as we passed a budget amendment in October to set up a startup fund for Helene expenses of $29 million to be balanced expectedly by FEMA revenue. So we are putting those expenditures there. Now, as we spend some dollars, we realize they may be reimbursable. We may move some expenditures there. And as Tim said, there may be reimbursement that we do not get. Therefore, we'll have to incur county costs, which means that those costs will then have to be borne by the general fund. So we're going to have a little more discussion on that this afternoon.
So basically, in a way, the FEMA is kind of set up as a grant fund, separate fund where you're running, okay.
Yes,
Separate from our general fund.
yes.
Which of these types of relief address lost revenue?
Direct revenue replacement, there are none. So as Tim said, there is this large Helene fund that the state has provided. They are distributing some dollars through state agencies. They did just provide us $199,000 for rental assistance for 1 month for folks who might have been impacted. And that was an example of revenue replacement, but it's restricted revenue to the specific purpose. I think there is some expectation, and it's not unwarranted, that after COVID, there were large amounts of revenue replacement provided to jurisdictions. And we received $9 million of coronavirus relief fund in 2020, and the following year, we received $50 million of American Rescue Plan Act funds. Those were largely, a lot of that was revenue replacement or a wide varied use of funds. That was unprecedented at the time and generally has not happened for localized disasters.
Rebecca, I'll just jump in to say that we have and will continue to advocate for some of these loan programs you're seeing on there to be, to be cash flow and to be revenue replacement. It may be the most important thing we ever do.
I just have one quick note. I would like to jump on Commissioner Sloan. Thank you for that. As we think about loss of revenue and how we, plug the hole, if you will, loss of revenue, it's hard to replace with, a source that is just one time. It doesn't fix the long structural issue. And, so as some of these loan products have been made available, part of our advocacy has been to see those become forgivable. That way, they're not necessarily have to be repaid, but also speaks to the need, to make sure that we're matching the appropriate revenue with the appropriate expenditure. There's one-time revenue to, fund a recurring expense from a structural standpoint.
So given what you've heard about the prevailing economic conditions and the timing of legislative relief, I'm now presenting an expenditure reduction plan for the county's fiscal health. Asking departments and community stakeholders to make budget cuts in the middle of a budget year is especially difficult, as the budget funds a year-long plan, and changing those plans mid-year is not an ask we would make if the disaster did not significantly impact our economy. The fiscal year 2025 expenditure budget is composed of ledger summaries, categories of similar financial transactions. Our ledger summaries are salaries and benefits, program support, education, operating expenditures, debt service, transfer. Our largest ledger by cost is salaries and benefits. As you know, in our fiscal year 25 budget planning process, we did not budget 100% of salaries and budgeted $10 million less to account for salary lapse due to turnover. In order to realize budget savings in this ledger, county management has instituted a hiring freeze, freezing all current vacancies with the exception of vacant 911 telecommunicator positions. There are currently 89 vacancies. Commissioners have a list of these specific vacancies in their packet. We estimate about $2 million in savings from this action. Libraries will operate on a reduced hour schedule and not utilize temporary staff. Additionally, the Sheriff's Office has agreed to freeze hiring of non-certified personnel, which equates to about another $2 million. These actions represent $4.2 million in reductions. Our program support ledger largely delivers services directed to the community via grants, contracts, or direct support. As departments combed through these services, $2.5 million of budget cuts were realized. These cuts will reduce funding for client assistance in social services and justice services, reduce funding for school nurses, and delay in economic. Operating expenditures fund the activities of county departments. The reductions of $5.1 million in this ledger and will postpone planned software implementations until future years. General services will defer scheduled maintenance activity, county facilities, and upgrades of energy efficiency. Health and Human Services reduces the capacity and operations of the animal shelter. Programming for the community in both libraries and parks will be reduced. Purchases of office expenses and medical supplies will be pulled back. Purchases of new or replacement non-capital equipment will be delayed. Additionally, all non-essential travel and training and professional development for county staff will be eliminated for the remainder of the fiscal year. Our transfers to other funds support community priorities to include early childhood and affordable housing, as well as transportation and also grant matches. Upon analysis of this year's transfers, we have identified unallocated funds for both conservation easements and early childhood. Also, given that we have delayed the reappraisal for a year, we are reducing the planned transfer to the reappraisal fund. These actions identify $1 million in savings. As we return to the ledger summary list, we have discussed reductions in salaries and benefits, operating expenditures, program support, and transfers. We have not made any reductions in capital outlay, as these expenses have either already been paid for or are balanced with debt proceeds, which would yield no savings. We have not made any changes to our debt service, as this represents the debt payments that we expect to make during the course of the budget year. Finally, there's $500,000 budgeting contingency. These funds can only be directed by the board, and we do not expect to make use of them. These actions represent a reduction of $12.7 million, or 4% of these ledgers. This reduction, when laid next to our revenue projection, reduces the gap from $15 to $25 million to between $2.4 to $13 million. Education investment represents over 28% of the general fund budget. The large majority of this funding is to our two K-12 school systems and our local community college. We have identified some savings in education-related contracts of about $175,000. We are asking the boards to consider a 4% reduction in the local current expense to K-12 schools, as has been made to county operations, of $4,690,451 to be divided among the two school systems by the average daily membership calculation, currently at $3,971,874 for Buncombe County schools and $718,577 for Asheville City schools due to prevailing economic conditions. This would bring the total reductions to $17.6 million of expenditures in the general fund, closing the gap between projected revenue from $2.5 million over to $8.1 million shy of balancing. This approach is fiscally cautious, and reductions must be made sooner rather than later before too much spending has occurred.
I do, but they can wait till this afternoon.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thanks. So we definitely understand the situation. And as always, we want to say thank you to our commissioners for the level of funding that you do provide our school system. I think the consolidation study pointed out that Buncombe County Schools at least was ranked 10th in the state for local supplement. Where I think we're the 15th or 16th largest school system in the state, though. School systems that are larger than ours. So thank you to the commissioners in the room for that level of funding. It is present us with a really tough challenge in our own budget and with the timing that you just mentioned. And we will have to struggle with that as a board and administration on our side. The fund utilization really goes straight towards human capital. And we're gonna look for those efficiencies everywhere we can outside of that, because we know that those folks that work in our school system are what, help us do things like overcome achievement gaps, and provide each and every student with a great educational experience. So, my question really is around, this is fiscal year 2020. What does your crystal ball tell you about that?
So we're spending our afternoon working with the commissioners is through some of the drivers for what will steer fiscal year 26. Our tax assessor is still assessing damages to parcels across the county, and generally it's March before we have an eye on what our next year property tax is going to look like, which is 65% of our revenues, and the vast majority of things that funds the activities that the county does. So in a non-revaluation year, we generally see 3% natural growth base. As you've seen from Jay's presentation earlier, there's damages to property, there's a slowdown in housing starts. we would not expect to see that 3% growth. Additionally, by statute, we can only budget at the collection rate of the prior year. Our tax collection office has been fantastic in terms of collecting taxes, and last year collected 99.75% of the taxes for the county, which has allowed us to budget at that rate. However, if we have flat or less property tax revenue, we can only budget this year's collection rate. We don't know what that looks like yet. So I would expect our largest tax revenue to remain close to flat or perhaps contract.
Thank you. Yeah, I know that there were, in our last joint session, there was discussion around trying to move at some point in the future towards a multi-year approach at local supplement budgeting for education. And I understand that with in a disrupted situation like that, that's likely nearly impossible to.
That's the conversation we'd probably be having today, if not
Yeah.
for the disaster.
Last thing I'll say is collaboration. And so there's been a couple of items that were just spoken about, whether it be related to TDA, the law surrounding TDA monies, or other, cash flow replacement programs that exist that could work better or need to work sooner. So I just would say to our friends on the commission that if there's an opportunity for collaborative advocacy to state or federal agencies to pursue those items, please, we're all in to stand up and speak up for the needs of post-Helene.
Yes.
Thanks.
Yes, there is.
Always.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
I appreciate the question about looking ahead. My question is about the current fiscal year. And I'm just noting, and I'm going to ask, because I'd like some perspective, I see that the biggest line item being salaries and benefits of the counties, and you all are identifying hiring freezes and some salary reductions and those sorts of things. When you look at education, at our cuts, ours are very likely going to have to actually be possibly eliminated positions. I mean, I don't think we're going to find those savings just with hiring freezes. And I do have a question. In our line item, which is less than the counties, we have a larger share of reductions. And so I just appreciate some perspective about our share of 4.8 million versus the county line item of 4.2, and tell me that I'm interpreting it wrong. That's fair. I'm trying to get my head around that.
If we go back here, we're making a 4% reduction in independent of education across these various ledgers. And then we're asking for a 4% reduction from education. So the reduction we're asking for is the same percentage reduction. Now, when we provide the local current expense, the school systems decide how they spend those dollars. So if they're leveraged in salary, that's not a decision that the county has control over.
So just help me out. I see 4.8 million. It's apples and oranges, I suppose, to me. That was just that one. Okay, I'll study on this some more. I'm obviously missing some things,
Could I
so thank you.
offer that what feels challenging, and I think Rob is uplifting it and Sarah's uplifting it, is that you've had the time to look at, beyond salaries and benefits, how else to take out money. And in a school system that's to varying degrees already fully staffed, right? Levers, which makes it difficult. So I think Sarah's looking at what percentage is salaries and benefits and thinking about the fact that that's so much of what a school system has to spend its money on. So the 4% that you're taking out, we won't probably have the same tools for taking 4% out of our budgets. And you're acknowledging that's the reality.
I acknowledge that the school systems budget differently than the county.
Yeah.
And absent education and debt, 70% of the county's expenses are salaries and budget, salaries and benefits.
What is the reduction that the county is requesting from AV Tech?
So AB Tech is funded through Article 46 sales tax. So we take $5 million of that sales tax to present funding to them. And then any funding above and beyond that, so that $5 million is state legislated.
Okay.
So that's state funding, that's not county dollars. Anything above and beyond that would be a county contribution. So AB Tech provided shelter space during the disaster and incurred damages to that shelter space of around $300,000, which they have not asked for assistance in rebuilding those spaces. If I applied a 4% reduction to so I've held them harmless since they are making repairs to their facilities for shelters the county asked them to hold.
So, okay, so I guess the struggle that I'm having or in my head about that is, I understand that some portion of their budget, I gather the vast majority of it, is state, to state allocation. And so maybe the state funds them far more adequately than they are funding K-12 schools? No, what am I missing?
So I think, yes. So what John is saying is not a state allocation, is actually the sales tax that is collected. We use that for operations. I think the sales tax we use just capital, but for AB Tech, we get to use some of that for operations as well.
Okay, so I guess, so does the county have discretion over how much sales tax goes to AB Tech?
No. What the county has is the agreement with AB Tech that we can take some of that sales tax and use it for operations up to a max of $5 million. So what we've done year over year is take that $5 million from the Article 46, your sales tax that you get from us, well, not city schools, but the ones that we give straight to capital, right? And we have no discretion on that. We were able to get the local law to say that the sales tax that we give to AB, we put some generalities to run a shelter, and their shelters got tore up, to be frank. So when that happened, we needed to spend $300,000 from general fund to go do that. AB Tech was able to take some of their capital and take care of that for us. So we did not have to come out of pocket to fix those two facilities. So with them bearing that cost, we did not then also reduce their allocation from general fund. So they are bearing a higher cost because the cut that we would give them, the 4%, which would be fair to everyone, was $148,000. They're going to pay $300,000 to help repair what is it we're doing. Secondarily, let me finish a second. Secondarily, there was another contract that we have that we went through HHS. We asked them to also cut. So the step-up program, the STEP program.
It's the STEP program, yes.
So we're cutting that from AB Tech, but that's the contract, right? But the allocation that you're asking about, the 4%, we did not go to AB Tech for a second cut on top of repairing the buildings on our behalf.
So I understand that, I guess, and I mean, this is no shade on AB Tech, obviously, or the importance of the work that AB Tech does. I just, if the $5 million, does the county have discretion over how much, whether to spend that $5 million on AB Tech?
No.
Okay.
The $5 million is the sale, so there's an article of sales tax that is collected in Buncombe County, and per state statute, and this is the only statutes, like, there are several statutes like this that affect Buncombe County only, but per state statute,
Of course.
all of that Article 46 sales tax must fund capital and operations for AB Tech. So AB Tech allows us to take a maximum of $5 million per the state statute to fund their operations.
How else is AB, I'm sorry to beat this dead horse, but
State money.
I'm just trying to figure out if the K-12 programs are bearing an undue burden here compared to AB Tech, which is, and again, not, so, yeah, and I understand why you're not, it's just that even our little Asheville City Schools is being asked to reduce our budget by $718,000.
Oh, I see your math. Okay, so the money that the county gives out of fund to AB Tech is only about $3 million, right? So that's what he's saying, the 4%.
Okay.
I think it's about 3 million. But the money that we give to Asheville City Schools, because of the ADM share is closer to 11 to 12 million dollars. So that's the difference in the math. But yes, we do give a whole lot more from general fund allocation to Asheville City Schools than we do to AB Tech.
Okay. All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes,
Yes, sir.
So, me is that there's pass-through money that comes to our school. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the 4% is based on the pass-through money plus the discretionary.
The 4% cut that we're
allocations.
asking for is all county dollars generated from county sales tax and property tax and other revenue sources.
So, but normally 4%, so there is tax that comes to us that's per pupil from the state.
And that money doesn't flow in the local current expense to support the school systems.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that.
John,
Yes, sir.
if you don't, and it's really just a clarifying question for me. So I'm seeing the policy minimum for Buncombe County, the fund balance is 15%.
Yes.
Well, that yellow box then goes down to, I'm just gonna say 8%. Why is it a yellow square?
So there's not really a law or statute guiding that says how much fund balance you should come. The local government commission recommends a minimum of 8%, which is 1 month of operating in a given crisis. So the county had established a policy some years ago to maintain a minimum 15%. And so that's what you're seeing there. That red box is what the local government commission, the minimum they recommend. The yellow box is above that, what our policy says. Our policy further says that if we maintain more than 20%, we will transfer any excess to capital projects. So
Pre-hurricane?
yes, currently our budget has, if we spend our entire budget, we will appropriate $16 million to balance at the end of the year.
That's helpful.
And that will dip us below the 15%.
And how much is the county fund?
In dollars,
In dollars.
that would be a question for our CFO.
So what you are telling us is that we pretty much had the perfect storm. You had COVID, then we get Helene, and we pretty much didn't cover from COVID. And inflation comes in and throws the whole thing out of.
Inflationary costs have been significant, 20% inflation over the last 5 years. And even independent of salaries and cost of living increases, when you think about all the costs of doing business, the costs of goods and services that counties and schools must then pay for, and find additional revenue to cover just the cost of inflation. So yes, that's been a major driver in expenditures over the last several years. And revenues have not kept pace. And to reiterate, with the use of fund balance, we balanced at the end of the year since 2002.
And I think what we need to talk about too is from layman's terms, when we talk about fund balance, folks, this 15% is very important. Why? Because we have a AAA bond rating. And what a lot of people don't realize, that AAA bond rating is important for us and for the taxpayers because it saves us money when we go and borrow short-term borrowing, and that affects the whole county. But that's the one thing that you need to understand, the importance, because right now, we still have the AAA bond rating. But Moody's and Standard & Poor's we're AAA bond rating on the watch list. And what that means is they are watching how we manage our funds. And that's very important, because if we lose that, that can affect our bonds when we go out and all. So that's where the county, where the school system is not really impacted as much, but you need to keep fund balance for you. But we loan the money. We do, borrow the money. Have to stay fiscally sound through this process. And it's something we haven't had to deal with before, but we've got to now. And thank goodness we have commissioners who understand that too. And that's why everybody, I hope, is on board and realize what we're doing is not something that we like to do, even with these cuts. It's something we're gonna have to do to get through this.
And to tack on to Commissioner Whiteside's over the last 2 budget cycles, and John and Melissa, you can speak more to this, as well as County Manager Pender, we have an internal policy of funding the schools at our restricted revenue growth rate. And we have surpassed what our own internal guidelines for funding our schools are to over and above fund what we've said we would do per our own guidelines and policies internally. I'm not saying that it's still not an uncomfortable conversation to have, but we have over and above funded what internally we are supposed to be doing. Very briefly, I do want to level set. I know the occupancy tax legislation has come up several times today. The county commissioners, I'm looking at Assistant Manager Tim Love, who worked with us. We worked with our local delegation to change that allocation of occupancy tax legislation. Buncombe County now matches what the rest of the state looks like in terms of how that sales tax, occupancy tax is allocated. It would be highly unlikely that we would see allocate funding for anything beyond what it already is for, particularly because we worked really hard. It was not easy to get that changed. And knowing that it now matches everything else in the state, I can't imagine the General Assembly saying, oh, we're gonna change it again for Buncombe County.
Have we asked, considering what we're talking about is a temporary ask and not going on from here on out?
Should.
Yeah, you need to ask.
Is there a mechanism, I know that everything you've shown us is due to the year, but if what school districts do is assess our ability, right, at this midpoint of the school year, and find that we have to use our own fund balance just to make sure we serve students appropriately and get to the end of the year, would there be any mechanism based on how things shake out for us to get a refund into that fund balance on our side if the projections are in the black? Does that make sense?
So when we provide you your local current expense, we don't have control over how you fund it. So if you were to make a request in a given year to replenish your fund balance in the overall annual budgeting process.
And I hear you, that sounds like sort of typical operations, and nothing that we're facing seems typical to me. So I'm just asking if there's like an ad hoc process that could be considered where if we dip into our fund balance in order to get just to the end of this year, and recognizing the forecasts, you've already said the forecast for next year, but there are pressure points for making budget changes, and typically January,
Which is why we're here today.
right, is something one for the current year.
Right.
So the only way, if we were to say we're gonna have to dip into our savings, just to be sure we can close a gap and get to the end of this hurricane crisis year,
I think
there's no mechanism
I'll
for
I'll
being
jump in
able-
for that. I'll jump into that. If we were to see money from the legislation that Tim talked about, there's an opportunity to pay that back, so to speak. So yes, I think that was in the communication I've had with the superintendents. If we were to see that funds to come, our plan would be to go back to our commissioners and ask that we didn't go back and share that on a basis back with you guys. I think that is only fair.
Thank you for that.
Make sure we understand that it's no guarantee.
Yes,
We'll get
yes.
the-
If we were to
By no
get.
means. Yeah.
Correct.
All right, everyone, I've been reminded that we are now at 12:35. And again, as I stated earlier, we could probably spend the rest of the day asking these really great questions. I appreciate the conversation, and we do have some next steps that we will be reviewing. Go for it.
So per North Carolina General Statute 159-13B9, appropriations to school units may not be reduced unless a general reduction is made in county expenditures because of prevailing economic conditions. At our next public meeting on January 21st, we will provide an opportunity for the school boards to present information and then ask the board to take a vote on the reduction. State statute prevents Buncombe County from using a reduction of the Article 39 sales tax dedicated to school capital. Other counties would have this latitude and could make reductions there so as to minimize the impact on local current expense. So just to say that there are directed sales tax for the schools, which again, in a unique state law for Buncombe County, can only be spent on capital. And in other counties would have opportunities to move those levers and work with those dollars. That is not something we are able to do.
That's really soon. For the hearing?
It's this coming Tuesday.
Yes.
So George, we have communicated on a public meeting where the superintendents or the chairs can come and speak and say how they impact. And then the board would have the opportunity then to vote on that, so. On the 21st. We've talked about that, and I think it was Rebecca's point that January is here. We can't wait much longer because spending is happening. And that's one of the reasons we've been talking about this for a couple of weeks now.
Additionally, we will bring a budget amendment on January 21st to formalize the interfund transfers discussed in this reduction where appropriate. Revenues will continue to be monitored for this year to include sales tax by communicating with our tax collector on this year's property tax collections and working with our tax assessor to project fiscal year 26 valuations. Should revenues perform better than projected and exceed or meet our budget, we will revisit these reductions. That's all I have, Commissioner.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. This has been a really great morning of conversation and digging into the consolidation report. The commissioners and the county staff recognize these are hard decisions that have to be made on a quick turnaround, and we do appreciate the collaboration with each of our school boards and our two superintendents to address the economic challenges ahead of us as a result of the storm. And so thank you for being willing to communicate and collaborate so that we can hopefully make some really positive steps in our budget moving forward and in FY26. And with that, I will turn it to Chair Thornburg and Chair Elliott to adjourn the school board meetings.
Buncombe County School Board is hereby adjourned.
And the Board of Commissioners are taking a recess, and we'll return at 1:15.